Welcome to the Miami Jewish Film Festival, the world's largest festival of its kind. My name is Elizabeth Schwartz. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm a lawyer and activist who serves on the executive committee of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, and I have 3 decades of service to the LGBTQ plus community. I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation today. First, we want to thank all of our members and our sponsors and community partners and all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting partners, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support throughout all of these years. I am truly thrilled and honored to be moderating a virtual conversation today with part of the team that brought you the brilliant movie Willem and Freda, which is premiering at this year's festival and which hopefully you all have seen by now. We are honored to have the film's director, John Hay, and actor Stephen Fry, who I want to say is the star of the film, but of course the stars are our heroes, Willem and Freda, who are the meat of the film. And so we'll say that Mr. Fry is the film's presenter and narrator, and of course is a movie, TV, and social media icon as well. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. My first question is for Mr. Hay. This story is just a fantastic one. And I'm curious sort of like how, we've all seen so many Holocaust films. They say there's no business like Shoah business, right? So where did you find this story, and what was the inspiration to get Stephen Fry to help you tell it?
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, I'm a writer and a director, and over the years, I've discovered that absolutely everyone has a story for you, and they all have a story that they think should be told. So I went for a swim in Brighton, which is where I live in the United Kingdom, with a friend called Rick Bosnan, who was from the Netherlands. And so he waited until we were about half a mile from shore before telling me his story. And it was the story of Willem and Freda. And it was so amazing. I mean, we just swam along for about 50 minutes. It was just such an amazing story. And when he got to the end, this is to show the world that homosexuals are not cowards. I just teared up. Even when I say those words now, I sort of like find myself quite emotional. And I just got out of the sea and I said, I've got to make this story. So I rang my writing partner, Rick Carmichael, who's a very old friend of Stephen's, and they went to school together, and I said, we've got to make this as a feature film. And he said, what? He said, no, this is an amazing story. It's going to take us years to get together as a feature film. Let's just ring Stephen and say, we should do it as a documentary and go to Amsterdam. And I haven't directed a documentary for years, and more years than I can remember, but I knew instinctively that Rick was right, and that's what we had to do. But I also know that whether you're making a drama or a documentary, the most important thing is that you have a good story, but it's also whose story it is and who's actually telling that story. And Stephen, to me, was like the perfect person to tell that story. I couldn't imagine anyone else doing it, and I still can't. And I think when Stephen looks at the Star of David, or talks about the family, his family murdered in the camps, or just says things like, it made me think that this is the fate of gay people. We will be outcasts. I think that sort of like just crystallizes why I want it. And I'm going to quote a review from The Guardian, just one sentence. I don't normally quote reviews, but this one sort of like really landed to me. He said, these are the visceral reactions of someone who has a personal connection to the history, not just a jobbing presenter or on another indifferent gig. And I think that's pretty much why I wanted to make the story and why I wanted Stephen to tell it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. That's so sweet. That's exactly what I sort of seized upon watching this film. One of the first things you say, Stephen, is that it takes real courage to speak out for a group of people you don't belong to. And indeed, this film seems very personal to you. And I have to say, many of us watching this here in Florida can't help but think of the fact that LGBTQ people here, especially trans people, are repeated targets of our government's cruel efforts to criminalize our very identities and to legislate us out of existence. And so of course, also compounding that, the resurgence of anti-Semitism globally is so horrifying right now. So I heard those words as a call to action. I'm wondering if I was like sort of reading between the lines, but I heard it as challenging people every day to act heroically, whether they have a horse in the race or not. You're talking about the likes of non-Jews like Willem and Freda being allies who should stand against oppression. How does that relate to, was I reading between the lines, or is that what you meant? To everyone?
No, that's exactly what I meant. I think you're completely right, and we're all aware, I think, whether that we need allies, whether as Jews or as queer people. We rely more on our allies than our fellow queers and fellow Jews, because we obviously have a stake in the game. We have a reason to cry out at injustice and hatred and the closing of opportunities and the reversing of progressive history, the reversing of the arrow that is supposed to be bending towards righteousness. And you feel that every time a straight Gentile speaks up for us, an angel cheers, as it were, because that's what we need. And we do have, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't speak ourselves. And in my case, I've always been aware, it sounds a very strange thing to say, is that despite the depth of my Jewish identity and the depth of my gay identity, I sort of pass as a very typical kind of Englishman. People often use that dreadful word, quintessentially English, about me. It's partly my education, it's partly the fact I'm rather tall and have blue eyes, but as you know, lots of Jews have blue eyes. It's not exactly a kind of proof that I'm somehow a yock. But it's somehow, especially in Britain, I think, it means I have what I regard as a sort of extra duty. Because a lot of people are surprised. They think of me, as I say, as a very embedded sort of Englishman, an Englishman who loves cricket and Shakespeare and, Sherlock Holmes and P.G. Wodehouse and Evelyn Waugh and, the very sort of, absolutely what American journalists like to call very English. And I kind of passed that test, despite the fact that, Eichmann and the others would open the shower doors to me and push me in according to my race. And I happen not to be religious, but as you know, being frum, as we say, being orthodox or being in any way observant does not help you when it comes to anti-Semitism. So all Jews have a decision to make, in a sense, which is: are we going to be defined by those who hate us, or are we going to own and be proud of our identity? And that's something that, especially in the last few weeks, I have more than usually grappled with, and naturally, or at least I hope naturally, I've obviously decided to stand. And so, even though this was way before October 7th and the recent wave, as Conor Cruise O'Brien said, a great Irish writer and thinker, anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. And we've found
Light
that
sleeper.
out. Yes.
Yeah.
It's a great phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when John and Rick sent me this, the outline and the story of Willem and Freda, I was absolutely blown away because, as you say, in the case of Willem, he was not Jewish, but he was gay. He was extraordinarily brave, really. He'd come out as a 16, 17-year-old to his parents, who were, and anyone who knows the Netherlands knows there's a sort of very strong Lutheran bourgeois outlook. We think of modern Amsterdam, and that's obviously very different, although even that is now changing, as the recent elections have taught us. So he was brave to have come out. He took a lover, but which of us knows how we would behave when the Nazis move in? How much we would want to keep our heads down and escape, or how much we would try and find like-minded spirits who would resist. And if you're of a military cast of mind, if you're brave, or if you're a trained spy, yes, there's a natural path you would go down. But Freda, who was actually Jewish, but not religiously so, and also queer, she had, bravely had open relationships, and she was a very significant musician. She was the first woman in Europe to have her own orchestra, the Klein Orchestre, and she was a significantly talented cellist as well. And it cheers up those of us who know that we're not technical people particularly, we're not militaristic, we're not strong and brave and necessarily highly coordinated and fierce, but we have minds and spirits that we think are fierce and do have a desire to stand up and be counted, and to find fellows at a period like the invasion of the Nazis, and to create, as they did amongst themselves, this entity, this artists' resistance, is a marvelous thing, because artists are very fond in times of peace to call themselves transgressive and difficult, and we bite the hand that feeds us, and all of that. But really, when it comes down to it, we like to be cozy and sip our tea in our studio or in our study, and not get too involved in the dark corners of the world.
And I think even though Willem died very young, I mean, he was sort of like totally absorbed by Oscar Wilde, who he sort of like looked up to. And I think, I'll have to quote now, Stephen would probably know this better, but I think Oscar Wilde says, to live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people just exist, that's all. And I always felt that they did, they just, even though they were only, Willem, and so many of those, the 12 executed, were sort of like on this planet for such a short time. They didn't just exist, they really lived. And I think that's very much what comes through in the film.
Absolutely. The bravery, I mean, just, and as you say, Stephen, sort of like how we like to think that we would all be just, oh, of course I would do the same thing, but who of us knows, and maybe not need to know, but as we see, there's times over and over again and during history where you have the opportunity to be in the right side of history, and I think your challenge is a really powerful one. John, the interview with Frieda, that you had, the footage of the two gay men attempting to lay a wreath honoring the gay and lesbian members of the resistance in 1970. There was so much incredible reporting and footage. I love seeing Stephen's notebook and all. It seems like this was my wife's a journalist, so I really love this sort of the journalism aspect of this, and I wonder sort of it feels like a lot of what you had was never before seen footage, and I wonder how you were able to get some of those archives, and was there anything that got left on the cutting room floor that you wish you were able to squeeze in?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I do love that sort of the big, what should we call the traditional archive? And I think we found it by, I mean, so many people sort of look at archive in terms of they go to the UK sort of archive houses, and you get the constant repetition as soon as you see the Second World War. And when I started out, I said to the editor, I just want you to look for archive for 6 months. And I said, I'm quite happy for you to do that. And so we'd already sort of selected the archive before we even got to shoot. And I think that was a great way around, because Stephen could look at it and we could see a reel of it. So you could see how it was going to fit in. But I think that what I was really surprised about, and it's also because so much of it was Dutch, a lot of it hadn't been seen in the UK and the US. But I think that that evocative personal archive. It's just those little snaps of Willem with his sort of cocked hat, and Frieda with that little wry smile. And I think when you get sort of Stephen's sort of undertow, this sort of loving admiration of them, combined with this incredible personal archive, and of course, particularly those stills of them forging, which I just think are remarkable, with them all sort of whatever, taking whatever, God knows what.
Partying with amphetamines.
Let's be honest. And sort of which you just don't expect to see, and sort of drunk, and yet still sort of forging away with all those sort of forgeries in the back. I just thought it was extraordinary. Now those archives, of course, were buried. The negatives were buried in the garden for many, many years, and only discovered. And of course, because they couldn't ever show that they were forging, but they buried them in the garden, and then they were unearthed many years after the war, and sort of we pulled them out. But you just haven't seen them before, really, not on television. I think that's the really remarkable beginning, and I think that, but the real thing, as you said, I mean, it's just Frieda. I thought at the beginning that Stephen would tell this whole story of Willem and Frieda, and that was what it was going to be. But then we found these 4 hours of unseen material from the US Holocaust Archive Museum. Frieda had just the year before she died, she decided to put a story onto tape. And these guys have gone over and sort of shot it from Amsterdam, and they used just just a minute or two on TV. But we had 4 hours of this material, and I think gradually just Frieda crept in, and it sort of like became Stephen was telling Willem's story, and Frieda just wanted to tell her own story. She just kept going, didn't she? And she sort of,
She was
and you have
amazing.
more and more of her in the film, and I think she just comes across as
And
iconic.
if I was a queer girl growing up and I saw her talking and I saw that photograph of her disguising herself as a man to cross,
Yeah.
you know, it's sort of like her version of the Von Trapp family going over the mountain. Only hers was so much more dashing and thrilling and sexy.
Totally.
Extraordinary.
It is
Brilliant.
those personal bits that get me every time.
And yeah, that's right. It's little moments. I mean, everybody's heard of the Heineken brewery. It probably never crossed our minds there was a Heineken family, and obviously there was. And so talking to the descendant, the granddaughter of the Heineken who was in charge of the brewery during the Germans, and this brilliant idea that she just sensed that he was anti-Nazi. But what a risk to take. Imagine, you know, okay, so wherever you are in Miami or here we are in London, the Nazis march in and so they take over everything. And we work at a big, big organization. And we think, the guy who's running it, dare I risk just suggesting to him that we do something to disturb the Nazis? At any moment he could say, I see. And then in would come a major from the SS and your life would be over. Instead, she says, you know, maybe, and what it brilliantly is just money. She needs money so that they can forge these identity papers that everyone in Holland had to have, and Jewish people had the J on it, which meant that they were always marked. And he had to say, well, you know, I'm not in control of the finances of the Heineken brewery anymore. The Nazis look over the books every day. She said, but you're a well-known music fan. Maybe you'd want to buy my cello. And he says, is it a very valuable one? She says, it's almost worthless, but you could pay thousands for it as if it were some Italian one from the 18th century. And sure enough, he did, and to his eternal credit. But my goodness, when she describes it, you know, how close it came, you know, wow, extraordinary.
And I love that she got the cello back. That was
Yes,
nice.
and
Hopefully she didn't have to pay the sales price for the
That's right. And the other detail being that Heineken had to shake, he'd shaken the hands of the governor of Nazi-occupied Netherlands and had declared loudly, now I shall have to wash my hands, which was very brave.
Brilliant. There's so many incredible details. I was shocked, as I think you were, Stephen, when you heard that the folks that then came back to Amsterdam had to pay tax.
This is a story.
Welcome, you're surviving the Holocaust, and you have to pay tax.
I hope I might be speaking to you next year, actually, because I just made a feature film with Lena Dunham.
Sure.
She was playing my daughter. I play an old Jewish guy who returns to Poland in the late 1980s, just as it's opening up through Solidarność and everything. And I find the house in which I grew up. My character had been to Auschwitz, survived, gone to New York. The daughter had grown up, and she wanted to see her, you know, where her roots were. We go to Auschwitz. I mean, it's a kind of black comedy as much as it is a family drama, and so I mean, it's
sounds
dark
hilarious.
comedy, yeah. And well, you know, we Jews, jokes are important. I was thinking of the great John van Neumann's favorite Jewish joke, which is set in Poland. You know, it's very good for our times, perhaps. The awful thing happens in the shtetl where a Polish girl is discovered raped and murdered, and all the Jews rush to the shul to talk about how they're going to respond to what will obviously be a terrible backlash. They'll get accused, they'll get blamed, there'll be a disaster. And then suddenly they see the president of the synagogue running towards them going, it's wonderful news, the girl was Jewish. Isn't that's so dark and so Jewish, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, that kind of humor is what kept us alive.
Terrible.
But anyway, yeah. But what's interesting, the kind of crux of the story is going back to the house where my family lived, and where a Polish couple now lives, and the whole story of how you know, families were not allowed back. And I tell Lena's character about that. And as you say, some were just simply murdered when they tried to return to their houses. They were, you know,
It was just terrifying.
let alone, yeah, I mean, it was just awful, both, and not just in Poland and the Netherlands, but in all of occupied Europe.
And having watched the film in the cinema, I mean, I've just heard audiences gasp. I mean, literally whole audiences gasp when they hear that. So it's just not well known at all, is it, in any which way?
It sounds fascinating. So what's the story called? What's the film? Does it have a title?
The film is called Iron Box.
Iron Box.
Yeah,
okay.
Based on a novel, and I hope I had to learn quite about 90 Polish speeches.
Oh wow, it's a lot.
So yeah, I while I was over in America, working a little on the morning show for Apple TV, and
oh yes,
and 3 times a week I had these Zooms with Magda in Warsaw, who would take me through the pronunciation, so that when I finished, we got to Europe in February and made it. But it was interesting to do a fictional film, having done the non-fictional Willem and Freda, and how much they informed each other, really.
Absolutely. This is not on my list of questions, but I have to ask, how was doing scenes with John Hamm? He's so painfully handsome. I mean, even as a lesbian, I'm like, I can't even imagine being able to remember my lines. Like, was that?
He's extraordinarily handsome, but extraordinarily charming as well. Really lovely man. And yeah, my scenes with him, with Jennifer, and with the sensational Billy Crudup, who is just so great. Yeah, no. A fun thing to do. I mean, supposedly we should be doing a 4th season now, but obviously the strikes have held everything back, as we know. Yeah.
I hope that you get back to it. That's good to know that there's going to be another one. So back to this film, and I think we probably have time just for one last question. And I'm so grateful for Stephen, for your bringing the personal story, the personal aspect of this, you know, with your family having been deported to Auschwitz and Riga, as an openly gay man, sort of talking about how being gay was no impediment to being a true hero. I think you remind us so beautifully about how Yad Vashem means a memorial and a name, right? Like emphasizing the importance of giving those that we've lost a name. And of course you point out how many gay people have been forgotten in history. So it makes me think there is room for, like, not only the Iron Box, which we hope to have you back and talk about, but also like a docu-series of other narratives, folks who've been forgotten in history. And I feel like you two should collaborate on that. So I don't know, are there any other narratives that you would want to be told?
Yes, there are. I mean, firstly, I think the world needs reminding that queer lives and identities, as we would now call them, have existed in the human race for as long as we've been able to record human activity, and indeed so have transgender and fluid binary, you know, non-binary lives have existed, not just in Greek and Roman culture, but all over the world, famously in the Pacific and in the Southeast Asia and in Africa, and places where it's customary to claim that any kind of deviant sexuality and sexual identity is somehow a Western invention, and we don't have that here. So I do think someone should do a bit like a David Attenborough or a Discovery, a real world history of different kinds of same-sex and trans kind of living that has existed, and it should be fun and celebratory. But just to remind people, I had wanted to do for the BBC an actual nature one, because I've been collecting information about the number of species of animal that exhibit homosexual behavior, if you want to call that, same-sex pair bonding, same-sex actual mating, actual doing it, and so on, because I did make a documentary called Out There, which was about, sadly, it was sort of about homophobia in India and Africa and Russia and South America, and indeed in America. I interviewed some conversion therapy frauds and so on, and it was pretty tough. But one of the arguments, and one of the people I interviewed actually was then Senator Bolsonaro in Brazil, who was horrifying. It was quite scary, really. And but the same thing, is this Yeah, he had said famously, and I quizzed him and asked if he still believed it, that if his son was announced himself gay, he would probably kill him.
Oh.
And it was just, and I said, why? And he said, well, because to have given birth to something unnatural. And I said, unnatural. And I explained, I said, at the moment, I've heard of over 600 species of animal, not counting insects, because they're perhaps too small and you would regard that as meaningless, but animals, mammals, lizards, fish, larger animals. But you know, there is not one example that has ever been found of homophobia in nature, except amongst humankind.
I love
Really?
it.
Really, which is unnatural.
Yeah.
And he then stood up and said, they've finished here. so
That is genius. And you turned him as a 180, and the beam is going to run it, and I love it.
did my best, yeah.
I love it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll do anything with Stephen Fry, so it's fine.
Oh, sorry, I've got to turn this bloody phone off. Sorry.
Oh, you're perfect. You're perfect. I did anybody have anything else you wanted to add? Because I don't want to take too much of your time. I'll if not, I'll just thank you. Thank you, Stephen Fry. Thank you, fabulous director John Hay, from the movie Willem and Freda, for joining us. This film is truly remarkable, and not only serves as a reminder that we want to be on the right side of history, but that it's really important to not just feel solidarity with others who are being oppressed, but to act. Once again, thank you to all of our members, our sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers for participating in the Miami Jewish Film Festival. And a huge thanks to all for joining us for this fascinating conversation about a truly amazing film. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. It was a real pleasure.